Good evening. Thank you for joining my book report video conference on the book Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking by Malcolm Gladwell. I am Cindy Jones. Gladwell opens his book with a fascinating story. In 1983, an art dealer brought a Kouros, a very specific type of Greek sculpture of a nude male with his left leg forward, to the Getty Museum. He wanted to sell the statue for a high price. If the statue was authentic, the sculpture would be worth every penny. They're very rare. However, the Getty was of course a bit suspicious. The statue was in almost perfect condition, and every other specimen known in existence was not. The Getty hired a geologist to do extensive testing on the statue, using electron microscopes and electron microbes and mass spectrometers and many other tools. He determined the statue was from the 6th century. Therefore, it must be authentic. After 14 months of analysis by top scientists, the Getty purchased the statue and placed it on display. They paid $10 million. When foremost experts on Greek sculptures and art historians and other museum directors saw the statue for the first time, however, they felt instantly that the statue was all wrong, even describing feelings of intuitive repulsion. After further research into the history of the statue, where it had been, it was discovered that it was a fake, a Swiss forgery that had been artificially aged. The experts that viewed the statue didn't know why they knew it was fake. They just instinctively and instantly knew something was wrong. Gladwell writes, "In the first 2 seconds of looking, in a single glance, they were able to understand more about the essence of the statue than the team at the Getty was able to understand after 14 months. Blink is a book about those first 2 seconds." In the introduction, Gladwell describes this intuition as the internal computer. This adaptive unconscious is responsible for the leaping to conclusions kind of decision making. This new thought is that the adaptive unconscious is like a giant computer that quickly processes the inputs we receive in order to help us survive. He gives an example of when we walk into a street and realize a truck is speeding toward us. We don't have time to think through all our options. We don't sit there and think, do I run across? Do I dive? We just simply move out of the way. Instantly react. So, first task of Blink is to try to dispel something that a lot of people feel is true. People tend to only trust a decision if a lot of time and energy has gone into making it. Children grow up hearing things like, time equals quality, haste makes waste, take your time, think things through, look before you leap, don't judge a book by its cover, and so many more. Gladwell states his first task is to try to convince the reader of this fact. I quote, "Decisions made very quickly can be every bit as good as decisions made cautiously and deliberately." So Gladwell proposes the theory of thin slicing. He defines thin slicing as the ability of our unconscious to find patterns in situations and behavior based on very narrow slices of experience. To support this theory, Gladwell provides the reader with many examples of thin slicing. One thing I have to say about Gladwell, he provides tons and tons of anecdotes, research, and super interesting stories. One of these stories, he discusses a marriage counselor named Gottman that, after only watching a couple converse for an hour or less, can predict whether or not that couple will still be married in 15 years with 95% accuracy. A psychologist named Gosling, this is another story, did an experiment that proved perfect strangers can learn as much about a person's personality by a quick glance around their bedroom as that same person's best friends know. I mean, that's crazy. A psychologist named Ambati listened to 40-second snippets of doctor-patient conversations and was able to predict with incredible accuracy which ones of those doctors had been sued for malpractice or would be sued. What's interesting about that story is that it's never about the mistakes doctors make that gets them sued, but about the relationships they do or do not make. Gladwell proposes that snap decisions or snap judgments and rapid cognition come from our unconscious, from behind what he calls a locked door. Why does he call it a locked door? Because humans, he states, are not very accepting of these snap decisions or judgments. Our whole lives, people, including our parents, teachers, coworkers, friends, and bosses, and so on, want to know how we came to a decision, why we feel a certain way. Decisions have to be explained and justified, sometimes with pages and pages and months of proof, as in the Getty statue debacle. Gladwell states, however, that this approach is a mistake. If we are to learn to improve the quality of the decisions we make, we need to accept the mysterious nature of our snap judgments, the fact that it is possible to know without knowing why we know, and accept that sometimes we're better off that way. To prove this point, Gladwell includes a lot of research. Neurologist Antonio Damasio has done some research on what Gladwell calls when too much thinking takes place outside the locked door. This part of the book is fascinating. The part of our brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which lies behind our nose, is a part of the brain that plays a big part in decision making. He did some simple tests with people who have had this part of their brain damaged. During the test, the people with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex never changed their behavior, even though they could articulate why it was wrong and what the consequences were. Just like an addict, people with damage to this part of the locked door can, Gladwell says, articulate very well the consequences of their behavior, but they fail to act accordingly. Damage to this part of the brain causes a disconnect between what you know and what you do. Sometimes it's better to let the decision come from behind the locked door, Gladwell says, rather than stand outside of that door all day thinking through your options. The mystery of the locked door. Gladwell states that we just don't respect the mystery of the locked door, and that can have consequences. So back to those snap decisions. When he asked people to explain their snap decisions or their quick judgments, people say things like, "It just dawned on me. I just realized. It just seemed right. It just came to me." But when probed further, people tend to make up a reason that seems plausible to them, or even worse, a reason they think you want to hear. So Gladwell warns you need to be careful how you interpret that when you ask people to explain those judgments or feelings or decisions. In the next chapter, Gladwell takes a bit of a turn and looks at the dark side of thin slicing and warns against possible mistakes. He begins with the story of how Warren Harding became president, simply, for the most part, because he looked and sounded like a president. He entered the Republican candidate race sixth among a field of six. He was absent for two of the debates on two huge issues. One was women's rights, huge issue, didn't show up. He was considered by historians to be one of the worst presidents in history, yet he was elected as a Republican candidate and elected president of the United States. Gladwell explains this by using our predisposed attitudes. We all have them. Some are conscious, some are not. But we all have attitudes about male versus female. Men are stronger, women are weaker. Men can do certain things, women can't. Women can do certain things, men can't. Whether right or wrong, we all have those biases and thoughts. We all have biases and thoughts about tall people versus short people, or thin people versus fat people, Black people versus white people. All of these attitudes that we are predisposed to have can cause bias, unfortunately, in our snap decisions. To prove these points, Gladwell tells 3 stories that illustrate what he's talking about. In some of the stories, people are successful with their snap decisions. In some, one in particular, they're not. The first story is Paul Van Riper's big victory. He was a successful commander in Vietnam. He was known by his men for his quick decision making. Oh dear. One moment, please. Okay, sorry. Okay, here we go. So Paul Van Riper, very successful military commander in Vietnam. His men knew him for his quick decision making. In 2002, the government decided to run a series of war games. And from what Gladwell says, these war games were very expensive. In fact, more expensive than some other countries' entire defense budget. The government set up 2 teams. They asked Paul Van Riper to be the commander of one of the teams. Van Riper thought, war is messy. He said, be thoughtful when you can, but in battle, when you're in the thick of it, there is no time for thoughtful decision making, and he had no problem acting on instinct, which is how he ran his war games. That's how the government wanted him to run his war games. The other team had a commander who analyzed, thought out strategy every single time, did not trust his instincts, did not trust his rapid cognition. He was very thoughtful about every decision. I'll let you guess who won. Of course, Van Riper won. So Gladwell says, in this story, snap judgments were very successful. Van Riper knew when to allow his subconscious to take over and when not to. He trusted it. Allowing people to operate without having to explain themselves constantly enables rapid cognition, Gladwell tells us. He also tells us that successful decision-making relies on a balance between deliberate and instinctive thinking, of course, and that in good decision-making, frugality matters. The next story that Gladwell tells us is about someone I had never heard of, Kenna. It's called Kenna's Dilemma, the right and wrong way to ask people what they want. So Kenna, from what I understand, is a rock musician. I had to Google him and find some pictures of him. I'd never heard of him before. Kenna's story is interesting. So a producer heard him perform somewhere at a local place and thought, oh, this is the next big thing. This man is brilliant. Loved his music. Got him in, recorded some singles. The producer sent it out. Other producers, record companies thought he had great talent. One of them even said something along the lines of, Kenna's going to change the world. So the record company that signed him hired one of those marketing companies to do market analysis. What they did was they called people and let them hear a thin slice of Kenna's music, a snippet. And it overwhelmingly received very negative results. With that thin slice, people did not like Kenna at all. The producer and the record company, however, believed so strongly in him that they went ahead and produced his album, but had a hard time getting it played on top 40 stations. They did manage, however, and booked a tour. What's funny is that when people went to the concert and listened to all of Kenna's music, listened to a big chunk of it, they loved him. So why did Gladwell include this? He included this story to prove a point that thin slicing has to be done in context. So in order to thin slice effectively, we should thin slice or use our rapid cognition, trust our rapid cognition with things that we feel very confident about or that we know a lot about. So he says this does not mean that when we are outside our areas of passion and expertise, our reactions are invariably wrong. It just means that they're shallow. In other words, if you are trying to make a decision or an impression about something that you are not an expert about or that you don't feel passionate about, you really need to dive a little more deeply into the subject matter before trusting that snap decision. The last story is very tragic. It's called 7 Seconds in the Bronx. It's about something we hear often in the news, an immigrant from Guinea standing outside his home late at night for a break, taking in the night air. 4 cops drive by. They're part of a special unit in the Bronx that patrols neighborhoods in plain clothes and looks for crime, tries to prevent crime. They drive by his house and see him standing on the stoop. And once this action starts, it takes 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, they ask him to show them his hands. He turns, reaches for, quote, something in his pocket, and they shoot him, killing him. In that fray, they manage to shoot each other too. When it's all over, they go and see that he's got a wallet in his hands, not a gun as they thought. So Gladwell talks a lot in this chapter about being able to mind read or read facial expressions. And he points out that these cops should have seen that the man on the steps was not showing any form of aggression, was showing fear. So why were they not able to read his facial expressions and know that he was afraid and confused, not aggressive and threatening towards them? So Gladwell tells us that the most common form of rapid cognition we use is making first impressions of others. Often these first impressions are correct and should be trusted. You know that when your child sees someone in the mall and they cower and cry, there might be a reason. When someone walks up to you and you get the creeps, you probably should trust that. Unfortunately, where we make mistakes and misjudgments is when we let our biases and prejudices, those that are subconscious or conscious, come into play, as the cops did in this story. You know, they drove by, saw a man on his porch late at night, an immigrant, and things went crazy. He also points out that a lot of police departments now, because of this research, are going from having a partner, two cops, or three in a patrol car back down to having just one, because when cops are alone, they tend to slow down and think before reacting. He Gladwell tells us of some experiments done by researchers to test for bias, and everyone has them. Even if you're one of those people that say, no, I don't have any bias, I don't have any prejudice, everyone does. We may not admit it or like it, but they are there. He also tells a fascinating thing, which I loved reading, that when we come into situations that trigger the fight or flight response or a super stressful response, our rapid cognition is not as effective. Heart rates after that are above 145, our snap decisions are not as correct. They start becoming wrong. After 175, when our heart rate reaches 175, we have he calls an absolute breakdown of cognitive processing. And he calls this becoming mind blind. He tells examples of people whose houses are broken into, or they're in a panic mode and they need to call 911, that cannot even dial 911 on the phone because their heart rate's over 175 and they are completely mind blind. They cannot. They lose motor control, thought processes, even some bodily functions, because the brain is in such a fight or flight response. It shuts down non-essential functions. Amazing. So Gladwell he closes the book, concludes the book by telling us the lessons that he would like us to learn in Blink. He states we can be careless with our rapid cognition. We must know the influences that can alter or undermine or bias those impressions. He also tells us that we can control our rapid cognition by being aware of it and all of its subtleties. In other words, yes, we can be careless with it, but we can control it and be even more effective with it by knowing what our biases are, knowing what we're influenced by, and being aware of that. He also states we should trust our impressions and our snap judgments when we take control and know our biases, and that sometimes we should not try to explain our impressions and our judgments and our decisions. Sometimes those decisions are better than the ones we take a lot of time to decide. There's a new afterword in my copy of the book in which he talks about some questions he was asked by readers after he published the book the first time. In this, he says, when to blink and when to think. So a reader asked him, so when do you know when to blink and when do you know when to be deliberate? And he says that he's going to give us a partial answer to this question. He says we should trust our instincts when things are very complicated, when there are many variables to consider. He puts forth that the subconscious, that computer in our brain, may be superior to our own decision-making processes, our conscious decision-making processes. And he says when to think, when we should deliberate and analyze, is when a choice is straightforward and that there are not too many variables to consider. I found this very interesting. As I finish up, I would highly recommend that you read this book. He's a great, great writer. Easy to read. It reads like a narrative, lots and lots of stories. The research is presented in a narrative structure. It's a very pleasing book to read, and I'm absolutely looking forward to diving into his other book, Outliers. So I don't see anybody else in the chat room or in the conference with me tonight. I hope that you enjoy this. And again, you really should pick this book up. Thank you so much for your time.